Welcome to the Inside Scoop Live podcast, where indie authors get personal about their books, their writing, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt. Join me for some lively conversations with debut indie authors and seasoned veterans alike. It's a great place to find your next amazing read or even get inspired. So sit back and enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. Florence Wetzel joins us today to talk about her new book, Dashiki. It's a cozy mystery that follows journalist Virginia Farrell as she investigates the murder of a jazz legend's confidant and the disappearance of priceless Thelonious Monk-John Coltrane recordings, all while navigating an unexpected romance in a whirlwind of eccentric jazz enthusiasts. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. Florence Wetzel was born in Brooklyn, New York. She writes in different genres, including her release, Sarah, My Sarah, a memoir of friendship and loss. Her novels include the thriller, The Woman Who Went Overboard, and the Swedish mystery, The Grand Man. She has also authored horror short stories, a book of poems, and memoir essays, and co-authored jazz clarinetist Perry Robinson's autobiography. You can learn more about Florence Wetzel and her work at linktree/Florence Wetzel. Hi, Florence. Welcome back to Inside Scoop Live.
Hi, nice to be back.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure. So let's talk about your new book, Dashiki. What is the story about and what sparked its creation?
There was two main factors that sparked this book. One is that, sort of to my own surprise, I got very involved with jazz journalism in the 90s. I knew a jazz musician named Perry Robinson, a clarinetist. He has unfortunately died some years ago, but just one of the most amazing, talented people I've ever met. And so I ended up co-writing his autobiography, which took 5 years. And in the process, I learned a lot about jazz. So when the book was over, I kept going, and I was doing CD reviews, and I was doing interviews with musicians, and I was reviewing books about jazz. It's such a rich world. It's such a fascinating world. And I mean, the music's wonderful, but just there's so many stories in jazz. It's incredible. So part of me had been thinking, I'd like to write a book and set it in the jazz world. And my corner of the jazz world, or my perspective, is of course from jazz journalism, which it's a pretty niche thing, but it is very interesting. The other part of it, it's a heavier subject. So what happened was I lived in Hoboken, New Jersey, which, as we know, is just across the river from Manhattan. And when 9/11 happened, I mean, it was devastating for everyone, but particularly, if you were still living in the area afterward, it was just horrific. It was, we don't need to go into the details. Everybody knows. So it was a hard time. And I found that I couldn't read. Like, I was having a lot of trouble reading. I was having, my go-to reading back then was like really heavy literature or like jazz biographies and things. And I just couldn't read my usual thing. So I went to the Hoboken Library, and I was just looking around, and I saw an Agatha Christie book. And I maybe read one of her books over the years, but I just thought, you know what, let me do that. Let me read something light. And I read the book. It was The Secret of Chimneys. That was it. And I just fell madly in love with her, because the books may be light and enjoyable and easy to read, but the plots are amazing. The characterizations are amazing. Her language is amazing. She's a goddess. Do you know what I mean? What a woman. And so I started reading lots and lots of Agatha Christie books, and they really helped me. They helped me get through that period. They helped me pass the time in a very enjoyable way. And I learned a whole lot about cozy mysteries, because I would call her a cozy mystery writer. It's not forensics So eventually what happened was I thought, I want to write a cozy mystery. Then I was very thick in the jazz world then. And so those two things are Dashiki. That's how it came about.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about the story itself, the synopsis.
Well, it's interesting because one of the fun things about writing this book was that, jazz history is obviously, there's facts, there's factual people, there's things that have happened. And one of the things that happened was in 1987, there was a 6-month, I guess you should call it like a residency, with John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk, the saxophonist and the pianist. And it was just this very seminal time. They were both at this very unique time in their development as musicians. And they really didn't play much together after that. So it really was a very important gig. And, it was very different back then in terms of recording. People usually didn't record them. But John Coltrane's first wife, her name was Naima, perhaps at his instigation, at him asking her to do this, she made tapes of, maybe not every night, but she made tapes of the gigs. And people knew about it, but they got lost over the years. I'd read about it many times when reading about Coltrane and Monk. People are like, oh, if we only have those tapes, we could understand how they influenced each other and how jazz changed because of it. So anyway, I always had that in the back of my mind. So in my story, there's a jazz journalist who goes to interview a woman who turns out she's dying, and she wants to set right the fact that she actually has these tapes. Her old boyfriend, who was not a nice guy, had stolen them from John Coltrane's house. So she asks the journalist, her name's Virginia, could you please help me get these back to the right people? And Virginia agrees. But what happens is Virginia leaves, and then the woman gets killed and the tapes get stolen. So it's two-part mystery. One is finding out who the murderer is, and then getting the tapes.
Okay. So you brought in both of your loves, jazz and cozy mystery, and combined them into your own cozy mystery.
Exactly. And one of the things I love about Agatha Christie's books is that not every book, I think not the Poirot books, well, maybe some minor characters, but there's actually quite a bit of romance in her book. And the quote I used at the beginning of Dashiki is a quote from Poirot, where he says that murder is a great matchmaker. So I thought, we got to have a romance here. So we have a detective, a Hoboken detective named Robert. And so the book is told from their two perspectives. And that was fun too, because Virginia she's an amateur detective. She's a journalist, and Robert, though, is like a real detective, trained to be a detective. So that's the story, with each of them gathering their clues and then slowly, well, you don't even know they're falling in love because they're so antagonistic to each other. But eventually, it all turns out well. It's a cozy mystery. So there's a happy ending.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about some of your characters. Tell us about Virginia Farrell. It sounds so interesting. Tell us a little bit about her, kind of what makes her tick.
Well, one of the things about Virginia is that she is working on a book. It's a biography of a jazz musician, a singer named June Christie. So
Oh,
she's working on this book, and that's all she really wants to focus on. And that really comes from me, because I remember when I was working on the book, Perry's book, with him, it was a very intense project, and that was what my focus was at.
yeah.
And I remember somebody actually at a jazz gig, they asked me on a date, and I was like, I can't date you. I have my book. I just, I remember saying that, but that's how I felt. I was like, I can't, I've got a deadline. I can't, be distracted here. And so that is very much what Virginia's like. And she is the kind of person who is just not interested in, like, she doesn't think about her appearance much. She's focused on her book. She's focused on the music. And so it's not that she's not interested in men, but, she really doesn't see much outside of jazz. And I pretty much got like that when I was working on my book. I think the other thing about her, and this is, I really like, and I hope I have this quality, but she really has it. She has this great loyalty, and she has this great sense of duty. So when she interviews the woman who has the tapes, and the woman asks her, can you help me? And Virginia says yes. Even though the woman ends up dying and the tapes are missing, Virginia's like, you know what? That's the promise I made. I'm going to keep it. I told her that. It doesn't matter that she's dead. This is what I'm going to do. And actually, the original title of Dashiki was The Promise, which is a song by John Coltrane. But
Oh,
someone suggested I change it to Dashiki, and I think that ultimately is a much more exciting title. So that's Virginia. And to speak of another character, so her roommate is, I guess, her complete opposite. So Virginia's like very short and not glamorous, but her roommate is this 6-foot-tall blonde who used to be a performance artist and was married to some high-flying Wall Street guy, and just is always immaculately put out. Like, she wears like a kimono, and she wears chopsticks in her hair, and she's, very self-confident and has more men than she knows what to do with. Her name is Socks, which is a name I borrowed from one of Agatha Christie's books because I thought
Oh,
that's such a great name for a
yeah, I
character.
love it.
Yeah. And they're roommates and they help each other. And then when Virginia decides she's going to solve the mystery of Betty Brown's death and the tapes, she, invokes the spirit of Nancy Drew. And she says to Socks, like, Nancy Drew had Bess and George, and I need help. I need you. So Socks is reluctant at first, but then she goes along with it.
Hmm.
So those are the main female characters.
Okay. So, how did Virginia meet the detective, Robert Smith, and tell us a little bit about him and how did he come into the story and how did you develop their dynamic?
So I wanted a detective and I wanted somebody who was very kind of like Virginia in the sense that very focused on his work, not really good at meeting, and dating. And so, yeah, and, like nerdy, like she's nerdy about jazz. He's nerdy about, being a detective and, murders and things
Yeah.
like that. And, knowing all the stories about all the unsolved mysteries and things. They meet because she's a witness, but she's also a suspect. So
Hmm.
when he goes to examine Betty Brown's apartment where the murder took place, there was a piece of paper on the coffee table with a name and a number, and it's Virginia's name and number. So she left it after the interview for Betty Brown to call her. And so Robert calls her. And so he comes up to upstate New York where Virginia lives to interview her. He right away is attracted to her, but he can't show it because he's there on business, and
Hmm.
she's a suspect. And she just thinks he's hopeless because he doesn't know anything about jazz. She says the name John Coltrane and he says, who? And she looks at him like, he's just insulted her grandmother, and so she thinks he's just hopeless and he's hopelessly, smitten by her. So that's how it starts, but they end up helping each other here and there throughout the book. So they don't have every scene together, but they meet up frequently. She is keeping an eye on him and he's keeping an eye on her. But like I said, at the end, it all works out well.
I love that. You have such a great cast, it sounds like, and such a great supporting cast from the jazz fanatics to Virginia's colleagues. What did your side characters add to the book?
Well, I think one of the things they brought to the story was just the different angles of the jazz world, which I suppose is really any form of art. But, I have jazz journalists, I have jazz archivists, I have people that work on a jazz magazine, I have musicians, and then just fans. And some of the fans tip over into being fanatic. So I think in that sense, they round out the world of jazz. You see all the different ways that people interact with this music. And the other thing was, they were just a lot of fun. I don't know. I wrote the book a long time ago and I don't remember like agonizing over like the details of the characters. I had some notes obviously when I started writing, but they seemed to pop up and fill in the gaps of who they were. So they were just a lot of fun. And there's a photographer too as well. So it's just like a nice, spread of people with different personalities. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned this is the second release of the book. Originally came out in 2011, is that right?
Yeah, it has a long history. I started writing it 2004. So it took me 2 years. So I was done in 2006. And at that time, even though I had self-published a couple books a few years before, early 2000s when, self-publishing was in its real infancy, I still wanted to do it the traditional way, to get an agent and to sell it
Hmm.
to a big publisher. So I queried 70 agents.
Oh my goodness.
I know, right? I was stubborn, but and then finally, or I had hope, and finally, I found an agent who really loved the book. So he did his very best to sell it, and he actually got very, very close at one publisher who shall remain unnamed. But they took it to a vote, and as I guess they do, and it lost by one vote.
Oh no.
Um, I know. So he tried for several years to sell the book because he really believed in it. And then finally, I think it must have been 2009 or something, where he just basically said, "I'm so sorry. I really tried everyone." So basically I wrote 2 years to write the book and then a year looking for an agent and then like 3 years, when he was trying to sell it. So I was pretty disheartened by that. And I felt really sad about it.
Yeah.
And so then I just didn't do anything with the book. And then this was one of those tough moments in life. One of my sisters died unexpectedly at age 50 in 2010.
Wow.
And I hadn't started writing anything else after Dashiki. I did try to write a sequel, that didn't work, but I sort of was taking like a very long pause from writing. And when my sister died, it really was like a wake up call and a sense of my own mortality. I'm only 2 years younger than her.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, Florence, you have to get back to your writing and you have to start putting out these books that you haven't done anything with. So I had a book of poetry and I had Dashiki. So I self-published them. So that's when I self-published Dashiki in 2011. And, it's really interesting. I know social media was around then, but it was really in its infancy and it was not nearly as sophisticated and definitely not the marketing side as it is now. And I
Right.
remember I did my best. I did things the old fashioned way, like, writing like press releases to newspapers and things like that. I was doing all of that and I got one wonderful review from the jazz website I wrote for, All About Jazz. I asked one of the senior editors if he could read the book and he did, and he loved it and he wrote a great review. But that was kind of it. That was it. I was just not able to get any traction
Hmm.
for the book. And that made me sad. But at least it was out in the world and it was published.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was it like kind of revisiting the old story and bringing it back to life, so to speak? Did you have to write new scenes? What wasn't kind of involved in all that?
I was fortunate in that I didn't need to write any new scenes. I'm actually working on another older book now, and I do have to write new scenes. And it is a bit tough writing scenes for a book that you wrote like decades before. It's hard to get
Yeah.
yourself in it. Dashiki, I was very lucky that I actually didn't have to do that. And I think that's probably because I modeled the book so closely on Agatha Christie and her, very tight plots. But what I did need to do was my chapters were very long. And a lot of times in the chapters, I'd have like 3 different parts. So I was like, why don't we just make this 3 different chapters?
Mm.
And also, like, a lot of my paragraphs were very long. And I don't know, I just wrote like that then. And in the meantime, since I wrote Dashiki, I sort of went back and got educated some more about writing and about structure. So I don't know. I wasn't good at like organizing chapters, but after having gone to a lot of different courses and gone to a lot of free seminars, I had a sense of it. So that was one of the big things, is like kind of breaking up the book and making it more readable. Because with that genre, it's not literary fiction. I think in literary fiction, you can have a long chapter with long descriptions and the reader's in on it. That's what they're expecting.
Right, right.
For cozy mystery, I think it's got to move pretty quickly. So those are probably the biggest structural changes I made.
Okay. Yeah, I think with that style of book, the cozy mystery, I think the short, engaging chapters just kind of propels the reader forward. They want to keep reading. But then if they have to take a break, there's a good stopping point. But
Exactly.
it's interesting. I think it would be interesting to see, here's the kind of writer you were back in 2004 when you started, and then in 2024 when you go back and kind of rewrite, to see how much you've grown. Did you notice a big difference in your writing technique?
I do. One of the big differences, big changes in me since that time is that through different nonprofit volunteering I was doing, I ended up doing a lot of like editing and proofreading. And then I actually ended up doing that like for a living. I was a freelance copy editor and proofreader. So
Oh, nice. Yeah.
yeah, so I, worked on other people's books and I also learned, just like little things like, it's not the end of the world to repeat a word in the same paragraph, but if it's a rather unusual word or if you could just use another word, it just makes the writing kind of more lively. So I was doing this edit of the second edition all these years later, literally like 20 years later. I was much more cognizant of when I was repeating words. And then also, little things like I had this tendency to just always use the character's name, like Robert said, blah, blah, blah. I didn't intersperse it with he. Like, I think you have to vary your writing so it doesn't seem,
Mm.
it can be kind of staccato if you're always like using the character's name. So there were subtle things like that. And then there was a big problem with the plot that I just hadn't seen. The timing of something was off, and it actually threw the whole timing of the murder off. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe, maybe it's good nobody read this book. So I was like, so I fixed that. So I was able to fix that. So yeah, I definitely feel that I've grown. And, for those two reasons, that I took courses, and also that I started doing that for a living, and I started learning about grammatical rules and just, other kinds of more subtle rules about, organizing not just a
Yeah.
text, but a paragraph and a sentence.
Yeah. Yeah. I would find it fascinating to just go back and look at something I did so many years ago. And
Mhm.
although I'd probably be overcritical of myself. So you have to be gentle with yourself, right?
Exactly. And yet at the same time, be like, oh, thank goodness I can change this. Like it was very satisfying to be able to improve things. I have to tell you.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I wanted to talk about the music a little bit more because
Hmm.
it feels like it's actually another character in the book. How did you write about something as intangible as music in a way that makes it feel so real?
So I wanted to talk about jazz, talk about the musicians, tell some of the stories, and describe some of the music. But I knew there was a great danger of overloading the text. This is a cozy mystery. Probably a lot of people reading this were not very interested in jazz or don't know anything about jazz. And I didn't want people to get like, bogged down in my writing or all the details.
Hmm.
So I had to be very kind of judicious about what I said. Try to, say enough, but not say too much. And, actually another thing with the second edition was I had way too many jazz facts in there. So for instance, maybe I had a list of musicians, like they were listening to musicians from this period, and I'd name like five people. I'd be like, Florence, you can name two people, like just
Ah, yeah.
I had too many names, you know what I mean? So you want to use the names, but not too much. The actual Dashiki is the name of an album, but it's the name of a song that is, the hit song in the book. And that's actually based on some friends of mine. They did a song. It was called Dashiki. So I just listened to that song like again and again and again and was able to talk about it like briefly to describe it because I knew it
Oh,
so well.
okay.
So I think that's maybe another thing too. Like if you know something well, you maybe don't say a lot. You don't say everything you know, but what you say is like informed by what you know about it. So I had listened to a lot of jazz at that point, not an expert by any means, but so maybe that was part of it too, because I knew the subject somewhat. Hopefully that came through in the details I chose to use.
Yeah. It's just always interesting to me how people take those elements and make them so realistic. And also, I mean, to that note, the same with the setting from the smoky
Mhm.
jazz clubs to the city streets, making them feel so alive. How important was it to you to capture that sense of place?
You know, I love place. I love places. I've lived in a lot of different places. I love traveling. So the main three places in Dashiki are places where I've lived. So one of Hoboken, New Jersey, and then Manhattan. Really, just there's the main scene is like in Greenwich Village around the Blue Note in that neighborhood, and then also upstate New York in the Woodstock area. So again, I think because I knew those places very well and because I have great fondness for all of them, I really enjoyed writing about them. But again, there's that same danger, at least for me. I don't know about other writers, where it's like I could write 5 paragraphs on describing something. It's like, okay, but what does the book need? What does the reader need? They don't need 5 paragraphs. They need like 1 paragraph to set the scene. So it's a real like culling process.
Yeah. So, which elements of your writing process were the most challenging, and how did you make them work together?
I think there's two things that were hard for me. One was writing about the detective, and because I'm not a detective, I'm a writer. And so I needed to do research. So I was a little worried about that. But, I just called up the Hoboken Police Department. And I said, I'm writing a book and I just need to ask some questions for research. And they were like, sure. And they made an appointment. And I went and I had my list of questions. And so I got the information I needed. And so I really recommend that like to writers, like don't be shy, you just tell people what you're doing.
Hmm.
So that was hard and scary because I didn't know anything. But once I armed myself with like the basic facts that I needed, then it was fun. And also I've seen like a million, movies and series and things. So I have a general sense of,
Yeah. Yeah, that
them all
definitely
working in
helps.
the boat tent. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like you can think of that. So that was hard. And then it became easy, which is, through research and work. The other thing that was difficult for me, this was the first mystery I ever wrote. And it was really, really hard balancing the clues and trying not to reveal the murderer too soon. And, one of the things that Agatha Christie does so masterfully is that you're just not sure who it is. That's what makes her book so interesting because there's a couple people who it could be.
Hmm.
So you don't want to play all your cards right at once. You know what I mean? And so it was really hard balancing that. And I had to go, and with the actual murderer, no spoilers, but with the person who it was, I went over those scenes with that person very carefully just to be sure, that I didn't give it away. But then also that I gave enough clues that it wasn't illogical that this person was the murderer. I mean, I think we probably all had that experience sometimes.
Right.
Hopefully not too often. You're like, really? They didn't. It's just that their motive. It's really almost motive. It's sort of
Yeah.
like, yeah, I don't think that would have made me kill somebody. So it was really trying to show this person's motive and show who they were, and so that felt right to the reader, and that it felt right to me. So that was a real balancing act. But it was fun too. It's a puzzle. It was, having this amazing puzzle to figure out, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah. To me, it seems a little bit daunting, Okay, I've got to have these clues and I've got to intersperse them throughout the book, but I can't give anything away. And there's that solving of the case that you've got to consider. And that kind of just takes it up a notch to me, as for the writing part of it.
I agree with you. I mean, there was, I'm a person who likes to write outlines, but this was a whole different thing because
Hmm.
it was, when do I give out this clue? When does the reader learn this? When do they learn that? And so the pacing of that is important, I think. And, I write a lot of drafts. So
Yeah.
I know I worked really hard on that in the first draft.
Yeah. What do you hope readers take away from Dashiki?
My big hope is that people will enjoy it. And I really remember how I felt after 9/11. And part of me really felt like if this book could just give someone who really needs an escape, who really just needs some relief from whatever's going on in their life, that would make me really happy. I mean, obviously, I'm happy if people are happy read the book, but you know what I mean? If the book could
Yeah.
kind of give back everything I got from Agatha Christie and all the different cozy mysteries and mystery writers who I love. So there was that. So I hope they enjoy it, and however that works in their life. And then also, it would just be nice if maybe people who aren't that interested in jazz, if maybe they get interested in the music, because I think what a lot of people don't know, I know I didn't know it. Before rock and roll, like jazz was America's popular music. That's what teenagers listened to. Teenagers listened to Benny Goodman, and they were like, don't let your kids listen to Benny Goodman. Like they'd be like, don't let your kids listen to the Rolling Stone or Eminem or something. So it was the most popular music. And like high school boys would know the name of all the saxophonists and like Duke Ellington's big band. But then rock and roll came along. Nothing wrong with rock and roll. I love rock and roll. But jazz took a second place. And then its
Yeah.
place has just gotten further and further back. But there's still plenty of people playing jazz. Jazz journalism is alive and well. Anyone can go to the allaboutjazz.com. Also, there's a great online paper called the New York City Jazz Record. And then there's the history, there's the older music too. So I guess that, maybe if the book opens a little window that people might want to open a little further and learn a little bit more about jazz, because I love the music and I think it really enriches people's lives.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know that I knew that jazz was the preferred music by teens back then or not, but it
Right?
makes kind of makes sense,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So, have you had any feedback on the book so far?
What really touches me is when many people say, I wasn't sure going into this book because I don't know anything about jazz. And then they say, I didn't really need to know anything about jazz to enjoy the book. I was like, oh, that's what I wanted. I didn't want that to stand in the way. You know what I mean? It's like if someone was like, I wrote a cozy mystery about like stamp collectors or, just some very niche kind of thing. It's like they didn't find that overwhelming and that they actually got really interested in it. And some people did say that they've started listening to the music. And, you know, on Instagram, as you know, you can have a musical accompaniment to your review. And I think just about all the reviewers have done that. They've like added a jazz song, which really touches me. And sometimes it's the music that I mentioned in the book. So I'm like, oh, you read, thank you. It's so sweet.
That is.
And
Wow.
and then another thing that's, well, it's always gratifying when people say they enjoyed it, but it's really gratifying when people say, I didn't know who did it up until the last pages. I'm like, yes, thank you.
A success. Yes.
Because, yeah, that nothing ruins a book quicker when you figure it out in the first 20 pages.
Right, right. Now, you mentioned earlier you were working on another novel. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so basically, I self-published 6 books back in the day. So I'm 62, so my back in the day goes back. So I am doing with them what I did with Dashiki. I'm doing a re-edit and giving it a new cover. So the next book is called Aspasia, and it's literary fiction. It's kind of like suspenseful literary fiction, and it takes place in Crete. And so that book is more or less done. And then I have other fiction books. And then I'm actually going to redo the autobiography that I mentioned with Perry Robinson. So I'm going to be busy for the next few years. I got advice from Written Word Media. I said, I have all these old books to put out. How often should I put them out? And they said to me, you should put out a book every 6 months. Like, you need to give the books time to breathe. And you need to give like the marketing time to breathe, and, you know, to not just be going back to the same, you know, the reviewers that you have a nice relationship with and be like every 2 months, like, okay, I have another book. Or so that's my schedule. And that works best for me too, because some of the books are taking longer than others
Yeah. Okay.
to redo.
That still seems a little fast, but you know, they're the experts, so.
Yeah. So, you know.
Okay, good. Nice. All right. Well, Florence, it's been so much fun getting caught up with you and learning about your new book and what's coming up next. You are going to be busy. Thank you for taking some time and sharing with us.
You know, I really love what Readers Views does. You guys have been great to work with. I had fun on our last podcast. We did this, and then, you know, watch this space, because I'll be back in 6 months with the next book.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Florence Wetzel, author of Dashiki. To learn more about Florence Wetzel and her work, visit linktree/Florence Wetzel. And be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.